Joining us now is Michelle Goldberg. She's a senior contributing writer at The Nation magazine. Michelle, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. So you've been writing recently a really interesting series of pieces on, I guess, between the kind of, first of all, I think connecting the right's social conservatism with its economic policies and not kind of allowing the narrative that those two things are sort of separate propositions, which we hear a lot, particularly when people talk about the Tea Party. And you've also been talking about this kind of shifting rhetoric on the right about poverty and in terms of how they relate to a kind of cultural populism, which has definitely been part of their kind of modern rise and coalition building in some respects. And I'm wondering, you wrote a review of a woman named Charlotte Hayes who has a new book, and the title is "Did White Trash Become the New Normal? A Southern Lady Asks the Impertinent Question." And I'm just wondering if you could tell us about that book. It already sounds incredible.
Yeah, it's this kind of vicious little book that maybe wouldn't be worth writing about on its own, except for the fact that, first of all, this is a relatively well-known writer, the founder of the Independent Women's Forum, which is a well-known anti-feminist organization. It's published by a prominent conservative imprint, Regnery. And it's also fascinating as an example of what I see as this shift away from the sort of right-wing populist rhetoric that we've all gotten used to over the last decade, or even more than the last decade. Thomas Frank wrote a whole great book, What's the Matter with Kansas, about the attempt by Republicans, the successful attempt by Republicans to kind of wrap themselves up in the iconography of the middle American everyman, NASCAR and barbecues and tractors, and as opposed to those kind of effete liberals on the coast.
Right.
Whereas this book is a broadside against, basically against the poor and the lower middle class. She goes on and on about obesity, about diabetes as a white trash disease. At one point, I'll just read you this one line, which I think, or two lines, which I think are kind of give you the flavor of the book. "We look like hell as a nation, and fat people bear a large brunt of responsibility for this. I can remember when going to New York meant seeing beautiful, pencil-thin people in stylish clothes on Fifth Avenue. Where are they now? The other day I saw a fat guy in polyester in my favorite New York restaurant." Now, this is, this is a very, very different tone than we're used to hearing from the right. This is kind of a much more nakedly aristocratic tone.
Right. This almost seems like she is like on retainer to express Mitt Romney's id or something. But like,
well, and
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, what I think, I think that 47% thing is the kind of thing that Republicans maybe, or we all used to assume that conservatives said behind closed doors, and the 47% gave us proof that that's what they said behind closed doors. But I also think it's evidence of something broader. Charles Murray's new book about white America, or newish book about white America, it obviously doesn't speak in the same kind of viciously sneering tone, but it makes kind of similar points about basically calling poor people. He talks about how the real problem behind inequality is what he calls a, quote, decay in industriousness among working-class white men, as opposed to a decay in the labor market. And again, I think you haven't seen these sort of attacks on the white working class. I mean, maybe you've seen them in policy, but you haven't seen them rhetorically from the Republican Party and from the conservative movement before.
No, absolutely. And I think, and so this is really fascinating because, Charles Murray, of course, is pretty infamous, I think, still for writing The Bell Curve, I believe it was called. I mean, that book came out when was even, certainly even before I went to high school, but he wrote a book in the mid-90s basically saying, this is no exaggeration, this is a straight representation of the book, that it basically, on average, African Americans are intellectually inferior. That explains gaps in achievement, poverty, and access. And this was kind of like the some people ran away from it, but it definitely was in the milieu of things like welfare reform and the kind of Republican assault on government programs that were at least branded as catering to minorities. So and then there was the contrast with this kind of assault on the minorities with a kind of certain type of cultural populism, white working class populism that Thomas Frank wrote about. What's happening now to push Republicans to take that same vicious and disingenuous approach that they used on African Americans, Hispanics, women, and now kind of throw it, it seems to me, like at a pretty essential part of their electoral base?
Well, I mean, I can't explain it politically, but I think, and these are writers. These aren't political strategists. So I think where it's coming kind of intellectually, if you want to use that word, is that welfare reform happened. So you no longer kind of have people who are luxuriating on even the stereotype. It becomes harder to sustain in the absence of the availability of kind of long-term welfare. So when we talk about welfare now, when we talk about social spending, we're talking about things like unemployment insurance, which we're having a big fight about right now. We're talking about cuts in food stamps. We just had a 7% cut in food stamps after a lot of kind of political debate. And these are programs that largely help the working poor. You don't get unemployment insurance unless you had a job pretty recently. And you don't, a majority of the people on food stamps either are working right now or were working recently. And so if you want to explain, again, if you want to kind of explain why these programs are counterproductive, are encouraging laziness and vice, which tends to be the Republican line, then you kind of have to go after the people who actually take advantage of them. And it's increasingly hard, I think, to do that in simply racial terms.
Right, and it's also you're absolutely right, of course, that these are writers, but we have Mitt Romney. Obviously, 47% was a blunder, and he said it in a private setting, but nonetheless, he said it. Paul Ryan has said very similar things. There's been endless commentary on food stamps, including, I remember one rep, which we covered. I don't remember what state he was from, but he kind of complained about seeing people who were physically fit online at a supermarket using food stamps. So this has kind of bled much more broadly into Republican, as you would say, quote, intellectual life and also politics. But then you also point out in some of your other writing that the paradox of this is that at the same time they also want to really hit Obama hard and Democrats hard on, what I think objectively is still a pretty anemic economy. A slower recovery, a lot of pretty, poor-paying jobs, and a pretty broad lack of availability. So they are in the position of kind of both saying, hey, look, the economy is not where it needs to be. Unemployment is too high. And then at the same time, there's this kind of omni-employment availability that's just not being utilized because people are lazy and stupid.
Right. Well, that's what I find amazing. And I've written before what to me is maybe the most amazing thing, if you want to kind of see how much contempt they have for the poor people, look at the fact that they kind of can't even really be roused to blame their poverty on Obama. So you basically, you have a situation where Republicans believe simultaneously that Obama has destroyed the economy and eviscerated the job market, and that the unemployed are lazy and just need to be kind of given a kick in the pants to go out and get all of these available jobs. And I think they're rarely asked to kind of account for the fact that they hold these two beliefs simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, so they're not only are they kind of asked to account for it, but do you see a danger for them electorally and in their positioning as they make these assertions and they're talking about people that they've relied on votes for? And this, I think, maybe connects with a thread that you've also connected really well, where you've kind of talked about, I think maybe a while ago, like even a decade ago or so, or it seemed less connected at a certain point. It always was connected formally, but the kind of social conservatism and the kind of extreme economic views that people still even like to talk about them as like discrete categories, like, oh, Tea Party
Well,
people.
those have always,
Yeah.
I mean, those have always been intertwined.
Right.
A balanced budget amendment was one of the main legislative priorities of the Christian Coalition in the 1990s.
Right.
And they're intertwined kind of not just tactically, but intellectually. Because, essentially, conservatives believe that people should rely for their social welfare on their families and their churches. Mm-hmm. And that it's only when there's a breakdown in those structures that they need to rely on government. And to be honest, to some extent, they are not totally wrong. Like, if you look at countries that do have very rich social welfare states, Scandinavia, Iceland, women are less dependent on men for their social welfare, and so more likely to become single mothers. If basically your choice is kind of marry or starve, that'll shore up the institution, potentially shore up the institution of marriage. And so, they are correct that an expanded social welfare state could, although I should say they're correct to a certain extent, because at the same time, we all know that marriage is increasingly becoming, kind of the preserve of the upper middle class that tend to have much more stable social arrangements.
Right.
But basically, again, they kind of believe that the expanding welfare state is both a cause and a consequence of family breakdown.
So, and do you think that, though, there's also another kind of, and I think we encounter a lot of libertarians on this show, particularly like younger libertarians, and I'm wondering if, it seems to me that there's a part of, we assume that all of this kind of attack on people for being lazy or not getting where they need to be, that, it makes intuitive sense that you're not going to respond well to somebody who's attacking you and saying that you're terrible, right? But it also seems that there are some people that almost buy into that message. Like, they look at this climate and they think, no, it really is because I'm not good enough. I'm not kind of succeeding in the proper way or fully fulfilling my potential or exerting myself. So do you think that there's another way in which they're also just trying to kind of formalize a certain narrative within people and as individuals even of, if it's a problem, it's my problem, period?
Whether or not they're kind of consciously trying to tap into that, I can't say. Mm-hmm. I do think it's pretty clear that, we all know that long-term unemployment is connected with, kind of depression and loss of self-esteem and loss of self-respect. And the reason for that is because people blame themselves for these things. And, no matter kind of how aware they are of the broader social forces, it's hard not to wonder, why me? And I think this is something, for example, that feminists are very, very aware of. No matter how aware you are of kind of male privilege and sexism, when you're passed over for something, it's hard to kind of discern, is it sexism or do I just suck?
Right.
And so, I do think that, that a lot of people are very, very insecure about these things. And I also think it's possible that it's also just easy for people to hear these messages and tell themselves that they're talking about somebody else.
Uh-huh.
I need these benefits. I need these benefits. I earned these benefits, not like all those other lazy people who are just, sitting on their butts and kind of collecting checks.
Right. That was like Chris Rock had a routine about the people listening to certain lyrics in a song and saying, "Hey, it's not talking about me." So I see what you're saying. Do you think, though, that because obviously in parallel to this, there's definitely a much broader discourse about inequality, kind of shrinking living standards. There's the fast food workers striking. There was the message that Bill de Blasio won on, becoming mayor of New York. President Obama said that inequality is, his sort of premier priority right now. That's definitely at least a rhetorical shift. So, do you think that this maybe, I think you actually said, in contrast to the welfare era when the poor were demonized and there was this perception of lazy people who needed to kind of, as you said before, like be kicked and forced into the labor market or whatever. And now that there's such a broader experience of people who work full time but are still in poverty, or people who are, just more kind of broadly touched by these issues, does that open the opportunity for us to actually start to rethink what poverty is and how we want to deal with it?
I really, really hope so. I mean, I think that for a long time, Democrats have been very reluctant to speak about poverty. It's something that Obama clearly cares about poverty. It's kind of where he got started as an organizer, but it's something that he spoke about very, very little during his campaigns. Everything is about the middle class, the middle class, the middle class. And for a long time, I think that's because there was so much resentment about welfare. There was so much resentment about kind of the social safety net that Democrats have really, really shied away from these issues. But again, kind of given the fact that we have so many, that so much poverty, that so many of the poor in this country are the working poor, kind of given the persistence of income inequality, given the economy, and given the fact that, as you said, so many Americans will either spend time in poverty in their lives or know people who are in poverty in their lives. I do think that there is a huge opportunity for politicians who will speak kind of more passionately and forthrightly about this stuff.
Yeah, do you think maybe actually there might be possibly a parallel between, I think actually back to how the Democrats were approaching social issues like reproductive rights and reproductive access, and also, certainly marriage equality. And there was this period where it was very trendy, probably between 2004, 2008, to, how do we kind of ameliorate ourselves on these issues? What are the ways of sort of, like Bill Clinton would say, safe, legal, and rare, and this type of thing. In 2012 and moving forward, it just is like, no, that we support access to reproductive rights, period. And that's connected to women's health, equal opportunity, and all the other things that, supposedly we're supposed to be backing. I mean, do you think maybe that kind of like the issues around poverty could kind of track that same thing, where it goes from an apology? Yeah.
I actually think it's a little bit different because, I mean, one of the things that you see with gay marriage, for example, is a huge shift among elites, Republican and Democratic elites. Definitely. And, there's nothing kind of redistributive about gay marriage. One of the things that makes the gay marriage issue seem like such a no-brainer and it seems kind of so breathtaking that anybody could oppose it is because it literally costs people who oppose it nothing and doesn't affect them in any way whatsoever.
Right.
Whereas when you talk about kind of change, when you talk about tackling inequality, when you talk about changing the tax structure and the system of incentives in this country, you really are talking about redistribution, which, is going to necessarily be a harder sell, I think, among elites.
Absolutely. I mean, so how much of the what sort of combination of that process then do you think is going to be like activating and speaking to the constituencies of working class people, middle class people, poor people, and really delivering and having a conversation with the elites where there's more of a sense about maybe, ensuring social cohesion, faith in institutions, the type of kind of appeals that have maybe made the elite more receptive to those types of policies in the past?
I mean, if I knew that, I would I'd be a political consultant instead of a journalist. I do think that, I think that there's a couple of issues there. One is that you need to kind of break through the conventional wisdom among elites that our biggest long-term problem is entitlements as opposed to debt, and kind of attack this really unhealthy fixation on the debt. And I also think that you won't probably see much change in the absence of a large, visible, angry,
Definitely.
organized social movement. Because, you're saying that kind of you need these measures to, protect social cohesion, which is correct. But the only way that you kind of convince people of that is by showing that there is
Not social
widespread
cohesion.
mobilized outrage.
Yeah. Right. Not social cohesion. Absolutely. Yeah. Michelle Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us today. I recommend that everybody read Michelle's pieces on this in The Nation, including the GOP's poverty denialism and many other pieces tracking these. You also just had something up, I think, on whether or not de Blasio can deliver on affordable housing, which is also really interesting. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Take care.